tooth. I'm an immigrant from Mexico, which means I'm a settler in these lands, so I feel a particular responsibility to continue to learn about the ongoing effects of colonialism in this part of the world, and to do my part as a public servant here to take sincere actions towards decolonization. Join us. Someone is there. We're wondering if they can walk in. Please come in. Speaking of learning, I was just reading the Yellowhead Institute's latest report on Canada's progress on reconciliation. Who here has heard of the Yellowhead Institute or has read that report? Okay, obviously the readers. Great. So a quick background. As you may remember, in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released 94 calls to action, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau personally promised to fully implement them. How do you think we're doing with that? Okay, I hear laughter. So after 8 years, only 13 of the 94 calls to action have been completed since 2015, and zero calls to action were completed last year in 2023. That is a completion rate of less than 2 calls to action per year, which means that if Canada continues at this pace, it will take another 58 years until the calls to action are completed, meaning that Indigenous peoples will have to wait until 2081 for reconciliation. Now, I say that because I think that a land acknowledgement is only meaningful if it leads to some form of action. So the action that I'm hoping for here is that those of you who didn't raise your hand when I mentioned the Yellowhead Institute, well, Google Yellowhead Institute, and you will see this report right on the homepage. It's only like a 13-page report. And I hope that we all read it. It's really important to learn why we're failing, how we're failing, and the ongoing impact that this has on our society. So let's switch gears to why we're gathered here tonight. Quick show of hands, who is here for the very first time in this room? Wow, great. Our marketing's terrible. Who's been to a library event in the last year? Maybe not in this room. Awesome, I recognize some of you, wonderful. So for those of you who've never been here, a couple of housekeeping notes. There are bathrooms at the end of the hall over here. There's also a gender-neutral and accessible washroom right behind here, so you can just go around this theater and it's right there. And please, please take a moment right now to silence your cell phones. In fact, you don't need to turn it off. We love it if you pull your phone out in the middle of the event, take pictures and videos, post it on our social media. Please remember to tag us. We love it when you tag us. But make sure your phone's not a symphony of noises and beeps and all kinds of things that are distracting for them and for your fellow attendees. I'll give you a second to do that. I see all of you are doing it. Great. Now, tonight is very, very special because this is the public launch of a new book by Matt Hern and Johal, who has spent the last 4 years meeting weekly for beers and putting their heads together to talk about friendship in this book. It's also a special night because it's a non-rainy evening in Vancouver, and you all chose to spend it here in the library. So as your amigo, that's actually my last name, I want to say thank you. And I mean it. I think that if we want to live in a vibrant, meaningful community where friendships can reach their full political potential, you need to show up at events. You need to warm up rooms like this and talk to strangers, which I think are just friends waiting to happen. So now, please join me in welcoming all speakers on stage so I can properly introduce them. So Matt Hern in the center is the co-founder and co-director of Solid State Community Industries, and he has led many other community projects. He teaches with multiple universities, he lectures globally, and his books and articles have been translated into 19 languages. And Johal over there is Director of Community Engagement at SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. He was a co-founder of UBC's Humanities 101 program and a chair of the Impact on Communities Coalition. He is also the author of Ecological Metapolitics, Badiou and the Anthropocene. And together, they are the co-authors of a previous book on climate change called Global Warming and the Sweetness of Life, illustrated by Joe Sacco. And Ginger Gosnell-Myers is of Nisga'a and Kwakwaka'wakw heritage and served as the City of Vancouver's first Indigenous Relations Manager. She's an expert in reconciliation and urban Indigenous planning and policy. And in 2019, she was appointed as the first Indigenous Fellow with the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue at SFU. So, 3 lightweights. It's amazing to have you all here. They're going to discuss the book for about 40 minutes, and then they're going to open it up to questions from the audience to start thinking of a very smart question, and not a lecture, but really a question. So Ginger, take it away, and here's the mic.
Great, thank you. Hello, everybody. This is quite amazing to see such a packed room. I think the two of you wrote a pretty substantial book. I'm really happy that I was able to download it for free, right? Because I think each of you are pretty adamant about not buying the book, right? Please. Yes. But again, thank you for making this open access, because it gives us something really important to talk about, which is how to make friends in the apocalypse, right? No, I'm kidding. I thought I would I thought I would start us off with a not so funny joke. Sorry about that. Getting into the philosophy of understanding the role of friendships and relationships in the era that we're living in right now, I know I appreciated all of the insights that you provided, the interviews that you conducted, and the way that you're able to get into the state of democracy that we're in today, and also the state of the relationships that we have with the natural world and the environment. That is a lot of talk over beers over the last 4 years. I'm interested in your creative process in pulling this book together. Matt or Am, you want to tell us about how this came about?
Can't do that. Well, hey guys. Hey. You'd think after 4.5 years of work, you'd come up with a longer book than 120 pages. But it took us, we started thinking about this. We started thinking about this book really back in 2016, 2017. And Am and I have had a practice for a lot of years of hanging out every Sunday. We hang out every Sunday, sometimes at the Portuguese Club, sometimes in Richmond, sometimes at each other's houses, as a way just to kind of lock in a time we can see each other regularly, but also a way to invite lots of other people. And of course, in 2016, 2017, like everybody else, and like I'm sure you guys, we started talking about just this startling rise in ethno-nationalisms and authoritarian populisms across the world. And in particular, we began to watch with all kinds of horror and shame and just dismay at the way that immigrants and refugees and migrants of all kinds were being treated. Certainly in watching just, theoretically or plausibly, otherwise decent Greek people run down to the shores of Greek islands and throw stones at starving refugee families, and hearing stories about maybe otherwise decent Hungarian people lining up to kick Syrian families just trying to escape from war. And all the kinds of stories that we began to hear about, the neo-fascist and rise of ethno-nationalist sentiments, certainly across the globe, but here as well. And similarly, at the same time, we begin to, just like everybody else and like you, just sort of wonder about ecological crises, and to think about ways that we could not just submit just to total despair about climate change and about other kinds of ecological catastrophes. And both of those things, both of those conundrums, those aporias, seem to have at root a similar-ish kind of root, which is a failure or an inability to figure out how to be together, in the largest sense of the word. In a philosophical tradition, people talk about that as, in the continental philosophical tradition, people talk about that as community, which is not to be conflated with like community in the kind of more popular sense, but in a way of like how to be together with other people and how to be together with other than humans. And we began in part maybe because of the forum that we were in, which is hanging out with a bunch of friends and drinking every Sunday. is that we began to like ask after the idea of friendship. And not in a, we were immediately, I mean, I myself am prone to insipid sentimentality, but try not in the sentimental sense of like, why can't we all be friends, or, you know, like, geez, you know, like, can't we be friends with that person? But in a larger sense of like, what does the experience of friendship, it's an experience that so many of us have in so many different kinds of ways, across like all kinds of different ages and experiences and levels of success, because oftentimes friendships are like the most meaningful and like most powerful experiences we have, but also oftentimes the most heartbreaking and most terrible ones. But is there anything about the experience of friendship in its flexibility and its porosity and its undefinedness that might offer us some kind of insight into thinking about new ways of being together? So that was the origin of it, was the origin of how we began to talk. But honestly, neither Am nor I are professional academics. And so we began to kind of like, and we actually had a practice for a long time too of actually reading together too. We would often just sit down and read because I'm not a bad reader. Am's actually a better reader than I am. But we don't do it as a professional practice. And like, honestly, we often get stuck in really hard text sometimes. So we actually were reading like books back and forth to each other. And one of them we were reading was this one by Giorgio Agamben, who many of you might have heard of, who's an Italian philosopher, and a book called The Coming Community, which began to speak to that particular question that we were after. And we were just reading it back and forth, trying to like, honestly, sometimes just going like line by line, paragraph by paragraph, going like, the hell does that mean? Like, what does that mean? And then, and oftentimes very literally having asked friends, colleagues and people, many of whom we interviewed in the book, but just trying to dislodge a lot of our own stuckness and trying to find new ways to think about it. And at some point, somewhere in there, we decided to write about it. I'm not sure when that happened. Joel, you got insight?
Yeah, I'll just add a few things. You know, Matt and I have known each other from East Vancouver community organizing, political stuff over the years. Back around 2011, I started going to European graduate school to do studying some philosophy, and I was in seminars with Giorgio Agamben. I took one with Jean-Luc Nancy as well. So even though we're sort of on the edges of the academy, we're really not that far from it. We are still around it, and after I finished my dissertation around work with Elaine Badiou, Matt and I did a project together where we did a series of road trips to Fort McMurray. And one of the interesting things about that project for us was to be able to write theory or philosophy in a kind of accessible way. The road trip, in a way, was a literary device by which we could talk about these things, because we were really trying to write to a broader, general, more public audience. And even though in some way this is not a sequel to the last book, to some degree, when that project was over, it gave us an excuse to hang out together to pursue different questions. And the important thing about philosophy and theory is that it helps us place into historical context philosophical questions that people have been thinking about for a long time. You know, everyone thinks their present moment is full of crisis, and people have been thinking about friendship and community as a site of thinking through the political. But what we were trying to also do was, you know, in this moment of ecological crisis, in this particular moment where there's rising forms of authoritarian populism, how can we think this through in a better way? This problem of how to be together, we're not just starting to come up with it now. Aristotle was writing about it long ago. People were writing about it 500 years ago, and people are probably going to continue to write about it. But in a way, this was meant to be our intervention, and that was what the project sort of started.
I think it would be really difficult to carry on these conversations, you know, through road trips or beers every Sunday with the pandemic coming upon the process, right? This happened right towards the beginning of the creation of this book, as I understand, right? And I think the pandemic was a time where a lot of us were forced to be alone. There was a lot more, you know, feelings of disconnection from family members as misinformation started surfacing, and we start to see, you know, this rise of polarization that stemmed from all of that. And it feels like the pandemic threw things off for a lot of folks, and I'm wondering how that impacted, your thinking around these concepts, because it feels like there would have been a natural connection, especially thinking about the role of friendship, in, really challenging times, but, you were actually living through one as you were trying to dig into a book in a philosophical sense, and testing yourself along the whole time. So how did the pandemic throw off your ideas?
Well, I'll start with it. It sounds too cheesy to be true, but we started writing in 2019, near the end of 2019, and we actually wrote a first chapter that was called Staying Inside. I promise you it's true. And then it was it seems sort of embarrassing now that we kept it, but it was literally true, because we were trying to think about questions around how to be together. And of course, this was maybe even the central trope of the pandemic was how could we be together? But also larger questions of who can you trust? And so I think we very deliberately and very carefully tried not to write about the pandemic, because we were sitting in patios and stuff still writing about that, but of course it kept intruding all the time. It kept kind of, sneaking past our defenses. And we were interested, of course, in thinking about permeability and about porosity, which is, of course, we became so familiar with how the air that you breathe is the air that I breathe, and how porous our lives are to one another. So there was, I think we tried, I don't know about this or not, but we tried oftentimes to resist the metaphor, knowing that we were in a very particular historical moment. And as a side note, actually, whenever I write something, for years and years and years, my basic practice was that I would take it to my grandma, and I would try to explain it to my grandma. And if I couldn't explain it, and my grandma was super sharp and all that, but she died 2 years ago at 102. But I would try to take stuff to her, and if I couldn't explain it to her, or if she got super bored, or if she was just I don't know what you're talking about, the likelihood is that I didn't know what I was talking about, because I couldn't explain it in a way that would interest her. But my grandma was born in 1919, and so she lived pandemic to pandemic. And so actually I did bring a bunch of it to her to talk about this, because I was actually working on another writing project that involved her a lot. And I was what from, do you remember anything, or what you told about that, or about, because she also, of course, lived through polio and all that kind of stuff too. And she was often around that too. And her argument was always that, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's not quite right, because I can't remember it right now, but it was always something like, we're never going to get through this alone. I'm not sure, but I don't know that didn't answer your question. Answer the question.
It had a big impact in terms of being able to meet in person. Of course, I had some health stuff in fall of 2018, and when the pandemic hit, just getting out of the house and being able to spend time together at that, especially in the early days when it was really difficult, and even having places to go to. I think also some of the people that we were thinking through in the book, including Giorgio Agamben during the middle of the pandemic, because of his very deep critique of the state, was very critical of the state measures being taken, and even went into a slightly conspiratorial zone as well. So some of the people that we were trying to work through became problematic during the pandemic, but we still continued to use them in terms of what we were trying to go through in the book.
Right. I mean, the pandemic definitely changed our experiences with one another. It opened up the staycation for folks, and so, most people are getting out, experiencing nature almost for the first time, it seems. I know that a lot of political lines started to, change during this time as well. I'm not sure if it's connected to, the fact that we were forced to become isolated from one another, but it definitely is a trend where we see, this increasing movement towards polarization. Political lines are being hardened. You talk a lot in the book about, new liberalism and the role of nationalism in creating, identities, and the role that plays in fostering, connections, mostly on the human side, and I think we'll get into the more than human side a little bit later. But, you know, looking at the political implications of this, through your research and through the conversations that you've had with between yourselves and with the folks you interviewed, how can friendship open up new political possibilities?
You start answering that one, Bill? No, you do. Come on. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Well, you know, and I think that where we started to work with, and we started to think through what is the experience of friendship like? What is that like? What does it even mean? What is it even like? How to define it? And one of the things we did often, you'll see in the book if you get a chance to look at it, is that we talk to all kinds of people, and there are 3 particular interviews that we focus on. One is with Jean-Luc-Nancy, who's a philosophical, I don't know, hero of ours, something like that, who we actually interviewed just before he died in 2022. 21. And Leela Gandhi, who's a philosopher who works out of Brown now and wrote a great book called Affective Communities that really changed our thinking a lot. And our old pal Leanne Simpson, who we've worked with and written with often. And each of those people that we went to try to talk to and try to think about friendship, and it kept coming up over and over and again, the idea of friendship as being, again, not in its insipid quality, but as a kind of relationship that is, to use the words of this woman, another theorist we admire a lot named Julieta Singh, is that friendship is an unfinished relationship. It's one that it's open and that it's unclear about. And that in her words, she says it's the relationship for which we have no other stable or fixed name. And so if we're thinking through, starting from the premise that nationalism has proven itself to be an inept way to be together, and that the failures of nationalism, and in particular of authoritarian and ethno-nationalisms, are ever more evident around us, in particular like thinking through like refugee and migrant crises, then what are other kinds of relationships? What other kinds of experiences do we have with relationships that are not defined by borders? And another person that we were particularly interested in, and we spent a lot of time reading and talking to, fortunately, was a Cameroonian philosopher called Achille Mbembe, who speaks constantly and tries to think through what a borderless world would look like. And what would it look like if no longer were we living in a time of thickened borders, of chance to build the wall, if no longer that experience of borders was not the constant carceral rendition that we have today, if we could imagine a borderless world, what would it look like? And for many of us, myself certainly included, that becomes very difficult to think through. What would that even look like? What would that even mean? But that experience of friendship, of that unfinishedness, of that necessarily kind of porous or permeable or flexible quality, what does that mean as another kind of way of being, in a way that is a way that is under constant negotiation, under constant compromise, under constant rethinking and reshifting? What does that look like in an unfixed and in an unstable way? And it's not to suggest that friendship is some kind of like, why can't we all be friends or something like that, but that what could that experience of friendship that we all have in so many kinds of ways, what could that lend to us? Could that offer us any traction for thinking about a borderless future? And similarly, to then transcribe that to our relationships with the other than human, is there other ways that we can think about being with other than human entities? And to even ask like somewhat, kind of nerdy questions, but to say like, well, could you be friends with an animal? What would that look like? Could you be friends with a river or a mountain? And what would that even look like? What is it, and how would you even know? And if one of the qualities of friendship might be, and one of the kind of historical qualities that people have ascribed to friendship, it involves a substantive concern for the other. And in many ways, that might be the polar opposite of extractivism. That perhaps that substantive concern for the other, that might be a critical quality of friendship. What would that suggest for thinking through a borderless world or thinking about an ecological world?
I'll just add a couple of things. With Jean-Luc-Nancy, who is writing with a number of people, Maurice Blanchot was another writer at the time. With Jean-Luc-Nancy, there's a wonderful chapter in that book, In Operative Community, called Shattered Love, that really gets into the essence of his argument. It's a beautiful chapter in that book. With Achille Mbembe, I was able to do a seminar with him online and one in person last year. And he's just a remarkable thinker. A number of his books are available. Not all of them have been translated from French into English yet, but the most recent one is called Brutalism that just came out earlier this year. But the arguments that he makes around borderlessness are quite interesting because he's looking at it from a decolonial orientation, from an African perspective, and he's trying to bring back a pre-colonial African archive to think about movement, to think about it in a different type of way. And oftentimes in a Canadian decolonial context, we're talking about the right to land, the right to remain, and this type of conversation between the right to move and the right to remain, I think it brings up really interesting philosophical questions. And when we did raise questions with him about friendship as a political possibility, what he answered back to us was he doesn't really think of himself as a philosopher of friendship because he writes a lot about the enemy through somebody named Carl Schmitt. And so in a way we read friendship onto his project, and it was quite interesting. Another book of his, The Earthly Community, where he talks about the planetary, is a wonderful book. It was published with an artist-run center in Rotterdam. So it's not one of his better-known works, but that one thinks about the planetary as a site of community, and it's where he talks about the more than human. And I think in that, and there's a lot of popular interviews with him that are available online as well, lots of online lectures, but really an amazing thinker that I highly recommend you going out to read his work.
Getting back to nationalism and liberalism, there's a couple of passages here that I wanted to read out because I found that they really grounded my understanding of what you're getting at when you're talking about the roots of friendship and how they can be seen in a modern way in our society here. And so you write, liberalism invokes a good nationalism of beer ads, common sense, immigration policy, the Olympics, World Cups, and flag-waving nostalgia, a nationalism that doubles down and reaffirms borders, defines the best of who we really are, and confirms our citizenship. This citizenship is bound up with liberal cosmopolitan ideals of hospitality that assumes an asymmetrical power relation where any migrant or anyone not from here has to prove their worthiness for entry. It is then a charitable idea rather than one of justice. Hospitality, by its premise, then has the capacity to become condescending, leaving the rights of others in the realm of arbitrary kindness, always contingent. And so if this is the society that we are living in, we're fostering our relations, we are building upon our communities with these types of ideals where our sense of doing good, our sense of who belongs is contingent on, the right type of person, or only, these are the bounds of your acceptance. What is that doing for the kinds of friendships that we are cultivating for ourselves today, and where is that leading us?
I'll just start with a couple of things. Immanuel Kant, in his essay a long time ago on perpetual peace, he writes about this notion of hospitality, the right to go to another place, to be accepted at least for a period of time. But then these other notions come in, and Deirdre wrote a lot about hospitality as well. And when we think about some of the nationalist phenomenon that happen in the world right now, let's take Hungary for an example, going from essentially a kind of form of Soviet colonialism to the early 90s of crony capitalism, the sell-off of state assets, and then you have the promises of the EU, which don't quite materialize. In that type of political climate, those who evoke a kind of nationalism, I think it's almost rational to understand the appeal that might have. as erroneous or a kind of in a figure like Viktor Orban, and in each place it lands down in a different way. And one of the challenges of thinking past borders, or the idea of the European Union being borderless and thinking beyond a nation-state model, but of course Europe does have borders. It has borders related to the Middle East, has borders related to Africa, who's in and who's out. Those are always questions that are on the table, and to imagine thinking about things beyond the nation state, I think, is an important aspect of what kind of borderlessness we can think about. It's interesting, especially right now in this moment, there's a writer, Dasgupta, who's got a book, After Nations, that's coming out in a few months. There's a number of people writing about this at the moment, and I think we try to, in the book, try to evoke what the possibilities of that borderlessness might look like. That's different than the build the wall kind of pieces. I lived in the Middle East, in Haifa, when the wall was being built between Israel and the West Bank, and you see the physical side of the wall going up, but also its deployment in different narratives in the same way that you see in the US-Mexico border as well.
Yeah, and I guess and a large part of that then is for us to think through then, like who is the us? Who is the we? And as soon as we begin to speak in those kinds of languages of, when we spoke about, well, they're welcome here as long as they adhere to particular kinds of, in this case, Canadian sensibilities. As soon as we begin to talk about the we, there has to be a them. There has to be, and immediately then, that imputative inclusivity is immediately then actually defined by expulsion, by borders. Would you be all right if I read just a tiny bit right now?
Oh,
Yeah, because I want to read something just a little bit. You were talking about reading a little bit. Maybe this particular example will do something for you. Well, now I got to find a little bit. Hold on.
There's a lot of dog-eared pages in this book here.
All right, here we go. All right. Okay, let's see if this works. See if this works. Does anything for you. As 21st century borders are gored open by gushing flows of goods, capital, viruses, and populations, this argument, this nationalist argument, groans under intense internal and external pressures, desperate to bend, not break. Aggressive racial and religious inflected nationalisms, opportunistic leaders, and populist movements repeat old arguments. Without strong borders, there can be no nations. Incited by the viciousness of these new formations, liberalism can only yearn for borders that are a little less racist, cities that are a little more welcoming, governments that are a little more charitable. This current crop of authoritarian xenophobes and military coups might well pass, but their point remains. Nation states have to be built on identitarian exclusivity, the us keeping a them out. Without strong borders, nations do dissolve. Contemporary forms of aggressive nationalism are not aberrations. They are new articulations of an extant form. Fascism is just nationalism taken seriously. Borders never end. There are specific exercises of power that follow us everywhere. We might imagine that as we cross those cartographic lines, as we pass through, then the border is over. We breathe sighs of relief when the border guard finally lowers their gaze and waves us through, when our papers get stamped, when our applications are approved. But none of us are ever past or over the border. The inside is always subject to doubt and scrutiny. No one's legitimacy is ever safe, and certainly never for migrants. We are all subject to constant management and zones of permanent administration that are now planetary in scale. I'm just going to jump ahead here. Okay. Consider this one example from our part of the world, a place steeped in its own mythologies of peaceful state multiculturalism. In February 1942, Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King's cabinet, reeling from the Pearl Harbor attacks, issued an order targeting Japanese Canadians. It was in the midst of World War II, and Canada saw an enemy lurking within. All through the country, and especially along the Pacific coast, hidden in plain sight, in cities and lumber mills and fishing communities, were Japanese. Many of these people had been born in Canada and were citizens. Some had been in the country for generations. Many were children. Any person of Japanese ancestry was understood as a threat. They were captured, held in detainment, then sent to internment camps and work farms, their property and possessions confiscated and sold. Resistance meant confinement in camps hundreds of miles away. Every nation state has stories of communities that have been persecuted in a form of collective punishment on the basis of religion or ethnicity. Nationalist identity and belonging can be revoked under the most vague of threats to ethnic and or religious paranoia and is repeated constantly on the micro and macro scales. And I guess then that question, then I'll stop there, but that question that we were just left with at the beginning of that was, like, what would, like if Anne was suggesting then to, like if we were to begin to think past nationalism and the nation state, like then what? Because certainly it's somewhat true to say that the European Union is borderless, except that 16 people a day die in the Mediterranean drowning trying to get just to Spain. So what would a world look like when nobody has to drown in the Mediterranean?
Right. You have an interview with Leanne Simpson, and you acknowledge that your discussions with Leanne always open up your minds to, I think, a flip side to your thinking. And she talks about borderlessness and relations with the more than human world in a decolonial way. And I think we've heard, you know, a good contextual summary of where we're at right now. Can you talk to us a little bit about what Leanne shared with you and your learnings from that conversation on decolonial thinking around borderlessness and the relationships and friendships with the more than human population?
I'll just start by saying, you know, one of the things that Leanne talks about in the interview, like that, the notion of borderlessness is that, you know, there's not fixed lines or something. It happens through relations between people that continue and shift and evolve. And the notion of time that she talks about through her language and culture in particular is really beautiful. There's a word, build-upon, that she uses and expands upon. And that notion of opening up what friendship and living and life can mean, and how space is opened up as a result of that, I think opens up what we were trying to do in the book, which was, you know, different than Jean-Luc Nancy or Leela Gandhi as Gandhi's granddaughter, who's writing in a particular way. And we interviewed Leanne with the previous book as well. And so I think it places those ideas into conversation with each other as well.
Yeah, you know, it's funny, we, with lots of our writing too, we often run it past Leanne and just say, hey, what did you think about this? And then by the end of a short conversation, we're almost always like, oh, shit, we gotta start. Okay, hold on, we gotta rethink that. But one of the things she said, I can't remember if it's in the interview or not, but one of the things she said, it's really difficult to place actually Anishinaabe territory on a map, because there actually were no fixed borders like that, and they were always being negotiated and moved, and it didn't make sense for her to be able to say, well, that's where Anishinaabe territory was at that. It was in a context, I think, of another conversation we were having. But also then to think through past those sets of relationships and to think through to the other than human world. Like, what would that look like? And of course, so much of her thinking, of course, like, extends that much so easily. And so it took some time for us to think that through and to say, like, well, what would a relationship, if we were trying to use that trope of friendship and use that experience of friendship to think through other ways to be with people that had that particular kind of like of leakiness to them, of porousness and of constant compromise and constant negotiation and constant unfixity. What does that look like? And how would we even, like, well, how would we even know? Like, how do we even know of what our relationships are with, like, you know? And I personally have a very sort of, it's sort of simplistic. I was telling you this earlier, but like, I live just on the Fraser River, and I can't remember the number actually. I saw there's something at Marine Gateway Station that's got this little plaque, and it tells you how many, like, I think it's 6 billion liters it's either a minute or an hour or a day or something. But see, some immense number of, you know, the Fraser River is just pouring water just past you. You know, if you just look at it, it's just a massive amount of water just pouring past you. And I'm not particularly precious myself, but I would not jump in that water. Like, I swim in almost anything, you know, but I would not swim in that water. It's just kind of gross. And I just keep thinking, sitting there staring at it, I keep thinking, like, how is it possible? How the hell could we pollute that much water? Like, it's the most unbelievable flushing system in the world, you know, just billions of liters flowing past, and still it's still too filthy to swim in. And the thing that comes to my mind often as I'm sitting looking at it is, that's just a really shitty way to treat somebody, you know? And so I don't have much other conceptual apparatus beyond that except to think that. And then to move that, say, well, what would it, like, I don't know, is our pets our friends? Could I be a friend with a river? How would I even know? What would it even look like? But I don't think I'd treat it like that.
Can you be friends with a river, and can you be friends with your pet? You asked the question, you cover it in your book quite well, right? And you get into, you know, the relationship that we have, you know, like through being able to touch, you know, a pet, and, you know, the magicness of, you know, seeing an animal and wanting to reach out and, you know, have that relationship with it. And so, you know, we're going to get to questions in just a minute, but I am interested to know, like, can you be friends with a river? Can you be friends with animals?
When you think about the generosity of a lake or a river or a tree, I would say yes, of course you can. I've also, you know, recently, a couple of years ago, we had 7 puppies born in our house. And so there is, when you see the kind of, what we have in common in the planetary, as Mbembe argues, is that, you know, what is our ethical and moral relationship to preserve life, to preserve that which is living in the more than human world, beyond the human. I think these are the questions that we need to democratize, because a lot of this writing on friendship and community tends to have a relationship to democracy. And if we're going to open up to broader questions, opening up this idea of democracy needs to move into a broader orientation.
Right, especially as we are moving towards the end of ecology here, right? It's right at the very front of your book, right? And so these relationships that we are not having today is lending itself to, I think, this direction that we're all moving in, which is quite unfortunate, and I don't think is one of our choosing necessarily, right? Yeah, I'm wondering if we have any questions or comments from folks in the audience right now. Okay, we see one question back here, and then we'll get to you in the back there. Okay, great. Just for recording purposes, I have to speak into the mic here. So, so folks who are watching online, I mean, it is about the definition of friendship as opposed to the other definitions that you could have used and the ramifications around that, considering its limitlessness.
Good question, by the way. I like that question. We talk about, one of the ways, because we try to kind of grapple with, like, well, like, what even is a friend? Like, how do you even, like, know what a friend is? And one of the first things we did is we contrasted friend with family. And so there's a little part in there to say, well, like, it seems like maybe that's a critical distinction, is between a friend. I mean, certainly there's a huge kind of long history in the Western kind of political tradition of thinking about politics as having to be between friends and enemies. And we actually reject that idea, particularly in the wake of Schmidt, but also to think through, and we suggest that politics actually has to be between friends. But then we were like, well, what is that then? Like, how do you know? And we started by contrasting it with family. But that also led us into a discussion. It's a popular trope in many ways to talk about kinning or about kinship. And and then we try to contrast the idea of kin with kith, because we're not at all convinced that kinning, at least in the Western context, in the English, in the constraints of the English language, that kin is the way to talk about dealing with somebody, about being together. Kin suggests a like meets like, and we then try to like explore, well, what is kith anyways? You know, you never hear the word kith except attached to kin. It's always kith and kin, and so we were like, well, what even is that, and what does that look like? And the answer to your question is kind of like, yeah, you got it, which is that friends have this particular unfinished quality to it, of this quality of constantly being made and remade that lends itself to particular kinds of political orientations and particular kinds of political fidelities that in our estimation opened up a certain kind of conceptual terrain. I hadn't thought of its universality. I don't know, you might have.
Yeah. I'll just add a little bit to like the title itself, Oh My Friends, There Is No Friend. It was a essay that Derrida wrote in his book. He was referencing Montaigne. Montaigne had misquoted Aristotle, so it has this sort of 2,000-year history of misappropriation. How it was originally used was probably more like he who has many friends has no friend. So it's sort of circulated in various ways. And I think also the relationship in the word philosophy itself, as etymology, has a tie-in to friendship. Friendship and philosophy go together to some extent. But there's also been more recent work like Jody Dean's Comrade. You know, why not comrade as opposed to friend? And one of the things about comrade is that one has to have a kind of political solidarity in order to have each other's back. But in friendship, there's an unfinished, it might be that one has a durational relationship with somebody that has nothing to do with politics, and yet you still have a level of care and you have their back. And so there's also, in a romantic relationship or something, there might be, there's an element of reproduction that may be attached to it. In friendship, like I'm friends with Matt because there's also a kind of uselessness to it, you know? We produced a book, but we don't need to do anything. We can just hang out at the Portuguese club and, you know, talk about sports or something, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's that part of that, like the kind of an anti-teleological, there's no particular end to a friendship, right? There's no actual purpose to it. There's like, and so in a philosophical sense, there's like, they call it like unworking or whatever, right? There's no necessarily or processual end to what that's supposed to be. It just is. And interestingly, too, to try to think past, again, it's not easy for me with my tendencies towards sentimentality, but to think past that, like, oh, can't we all be friends, or can't we just hold hands and get along? But that, you know, many times I think that friendship certainly doesn't even have to be friendly. That very oftentimes, you know, it's trying to invoke an astringent view of friendship too. And in many ways, friends are the ones who tell you things you don't want to hear, and the ones who can, and to think that through too. But to keep kind of pushing the edges of that, to think through, like, not to revert just to like some, like, you know, like in the insipidness of the way, like one of my closest colleagues, when she heard I was writing a book about friendship, she was like, oh, that's so sweet, you and your friend wrote a book about friendship. And I was like, shit, you know. And but what is that? What could that unsettle in us, right? Like, what could it unsettle and what could it move it if we begin to think friendship as the political?
Yeah, thank you. We have a question right in the back. Great. So the question was our responsibility and care in a borderless situation, like our care for the ocean as a good example. So, Matt.
Yeah, it's a super good question, and you know, like the folks who, like in our you know, recent memory, who are most articulate and have been thinking about borderlessness initially or like immediately are like the early kind of theorists of neoliberalism, right? Of like eviscerating national borders to create one giant one world market and to allow unfettered capital access to all the world's resources. And the idea of borderlessness is fraught, for sure. And if that's what you are gesturing towards, we like share that trepidation in many ways, right? Is that particularly, well, who is responsible for a piece of land? Who can who's able to to regulate, who is able to, like, what does that even mean, you know? And so it opens up this kind of vast kind of like vertiginous kind of space of like, I don't know, like how would anything mean anything if like, if certain, you know, jurisdictions are not responsible for particular pieces of land. And so and it opens up like perilous territory as well, for certain. And I think that part then is the part where I think we lean on a lot of our interlocutors, and to lean on the idea that the nation state as a particular political formation is relatively recent and extraordinarily fragile and punctured almost at the most flimsy of excuses. So to then think, not necessarily to that, like from a notion of like a fearfulness of that, but to think through that the nation state is a relatively recent phenomenon, one which is not immutable. So then what else? Then what does it mean to care for a piece of land? And it's a place where somebody like, for example, Leanne offers all kinds of like insight into that. And even to say, well, how would you even know where Anishinaabe territory was if there wasn't a border? Like how, and even that, to begin to open up that conceptual territory for us is super like generative and useful. And I think that is to refuse easy like retreat into the us, I think is the answer to that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, you know, with one of the arguments Mbembe makes around borderlessness is, you know, why does the accident of our birth determine where we can move? You know, if one is born in a certain nation state and somebody in another, you're already reliant upon which passport you have, which has limitations to mobility and freedom. So we have an inequality built in right from the outset, and that's what he's trying to trouble in his work. And I think it's important to kind of think through what already gets built in right at the moment. I'm just going to read a tiny bit here. If we were to adequately think past the colonial fixities of nationalist thinking between the preservation and thriving of life in the earth in a planetary sense, we offer that friendship allows a possible route out from this closure. A borderless world is possible where revolutionary politics runs through constantly unfinished exposure, a vitalist politics that speaks to solidarities with the more than human. The adjudication of ecological crises is currently contained primarily inside the human. If we can acknowledge creativity and subjectivities of the more than human world, a new possibility of the political emerges. As Mbembe writes, and I'm going to quote him here, the Earth's specificity lies in that it makes room for all its inhabitants with no distinction of race or species. It mocks both the blind particular and the bare singularity. It reminds us of how each body, human or otherwise, however singular, bears on it and within it, in its essential porosity, not the marks of the universal, but the traces of the incommon. As a result, every politics of the living rests, by definition, on the idea that the living is that which is priceless. And because it is priceless, it is fundamentally beyond measure. As such, it can neither be counted nor weighed. It belongs simply to the incalculable.
Thank you. We have a question up here. I cannot repeat that, but it was very well said, right? And Matt or I mean, she offered a lot there, right? One is the intergenerational nature of ensuring that enduring friendships are even possible in this largely digital era, and also, you know, I think poor role modeling that I think our nation-state governments are imposing upon us, and I think the violence that they bring down on folks who probably don't necessarily belong to a large degree, and like, what does this mean for our friendships and the role modeling that we should be providing here at the local level, and also, I think, at the larger level.
Thanks, Len. There's about 8 really good questions in there. I would just actually go back to the thing you said right at the very beginning there. It was really interesting. The question of like, who are your friends? It's actually such a good question in so many ways. And, you know, I think a lot of us ask ourselves that like in good times, but in particular in bad times, you know? And I think it might be argued that we're in a particular kind of collectively bad time right now. So maybe there's a particular kind of pressingness to that question. And it begins to, you know, bleed a little bit into a question of like comrade, right? It's like who are your comrades? But I think it's a better question to ask, who are your friends? And is that who could you rely on? Is that who? And I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to that question, which I think makes it so poignant. And it's a question that I think many of us ask ourselves often in many circumstances. But I think I think if we could even transpose that further and ask that question about like other than humans, and I think we could ask that in the reverse of like, how would you know, like, again, like, you know, if I could offer some kind of friendship to, say, that river, how would it even know? And how would I even know if it knew? And what would that even look like? And how would that be? I think many of us fantasize that we have friendships with other than humans, but I'm not sure if that's true or not, and how would that be justified, and how would we be able to exhibit that substantive care in another way? So that's the beginning of the question, but I just want to say what a great question it is. I think it's a good question to keep asking.
I think we're almost at time, but I'm just going to read a part of the book which I think gestures towards a couple of your questions. There is an unaccountability of accelerated time that closes in on itself through the proliferation of fires, floods, displacements, and artificial intelligence careening beyond human or technological control. The right to move becomes non-negotiable as a site of existential preservation. To imagine a world beyond borders and the extension of a carceral landscape is to be inside the reflexive plasticity of dwelling on the earth. It is through the assembling of practices by which living beings and the more than human cohabitate with friendship and hazard the tenuous formation of communities. The return to mutuality, transformative solidarity, the recognition of our planetary vulnerability beyond the limits of reactionary human identities is a call to collectively reinvigorate our existence in the time that remains, to build proximity to seemingly impossible justice. The organizing of a series of ruptures towards a new life is to think around the inherited order and open the door to the potency and poetry of new thresholds through visible and invisible solidarities where the creative mutations of politics can form promiscuous alliances that surpass contemporary thresholds and modes of the possible.
Matt, thank you so much for such a brilliant conversation on a really incredible book that dives deep into not just the politics of friendships, but the roots of our relationships with each other and the land. I think it tells us a lot about where we're at, where we're going, given where we are at right now, but also where we could go if we valued, I think, relationships with the more than human world, if we valued our relationships with each other, I think a little bit more, with more humanity. So thank you. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. I know we had more questions in the audience. I think we're allowed to stick around for a little bit longer if you wanted to come up and talk to Am and Matt. But we do have the library, which is actually closing its doors right at 8:30. So we want to make sure that we're not giving security more than what they can handle. So thank you, everyone.
If I could.
Thank you, Ginger. Thank you, Jorge.
So you jumped on that. I appreciate you. Oh, yeah. I'd say thanks to you, but thanks, Ginger. Thanks so much for doing it. Really glad to do it with you. Thank you.